Before we begin, I want to say something. If the kind of story I'm about to share with you tonight is the sort that makes you want more, not just one, but 10 of them, each delivered in full, told in a voice that belongs in the shadows, then I've got something for you. There's a collection called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files from 10 counties across 5 states spanning 1893 to 1955. Every single one of them involves people who walked into terrain that looked easy enough, and every single one was closed out by the authorities with a word that never quite fit. 10 hours of material to settle in with, from beginning to end. The link is down in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, there are ridges in the old country of Western Virginia, what most of you know today as West Virginia, where the ground has a way of holding on to what gets placed into it. Not letting it decay, not letting it rest, just holding it. Before I go any further, I'd like to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments. I like knowing which house has the lamp burning for this one. What I'm about to tell you comes from the autumn of 1852. It takes place in a hollow off a mountain the old maps called Kettlehorn Ridge, in a stretch of country that fed down into the settlement of Merida. On paper, that land was farmland, corn and hogs, a little tobacco, timber a bit higher up. From the wagon road, it looked like every other place the pioneers had carved out. It was not every other place. The man at the center of this story was Ambrose Verheart. 44 years old that autumn, a country doctor. He'd been practicing out of a 2-room house at the far end of Merida's main street for the better part of 17 years. And if you'd asked anyone in town about him, they'd have told you the same thing. Quiet man, steady hands, a widower. His wife had been taken by a fever in the winter of '39, and something in him had gone with her. After that, he took to long rides out into the hollows, tending anyone who couldn't make the trip down to town. He had a reputation for going where other men wouldn't. He was tall, hair going gray at the temples, blue eyes worn pale by weather, big, knuckled hands from splitting his own wood. He kept a bay mare named Odessa, an old bag of instruments, a coat with a pocket sewn up on the inside for glass files, and a small pistol he'd never once had to draw. He rode alone. He read at night, and every evening before bed, he wrote in a journal, long, careful entries in a hand you could read from across a room. And it's because of that journal that any of what I'm about to tell you is known at all. Hold on to that for a minute, because a lot of what comes out of these mountains dies with the man who witnessed it. This didn't. This one got written down. There's a page in Ambrose Verheart's journal dated the 10th of October, 1852, that reads as ordinary as any page that came before it. Rain. Bay mare shud. Mrs. Peel delivered of a healthy boy. Bill paid in eggs. That's what he wrote at supper on the 10th. He closed the journal, set it on the sideboard by his lamp, and went to bed thinking about a chest cold he'd been treating in a woodcutter's household on the north end of town. That was the last page of the journal that read like any other. The knock came before dawn on the 11th. Ambrose lit a candle and went to the door in his shirt and trousers. Standing on the porch, hat in his hand, was a tall man he'd never seen before, rain on the brim, rain in the coat, a face like the side of a hatchet, long, quiet, calm. The man said his name was Osmond Sheldrake, and he'd ridden 2 days down from Kettlehorn Ridge because his mother was dying. Ambrose asked what she suffered from. Osmond said she was old. She was tired. She'd been coughing for a month, and last week she'd stopped rising from her bed, and yesterday she'd stopped speaking. Something needed doing before the end, so the family could say a doctor had been called. Ambrose asked why he hadn't sent a boy. Osmond said, "There are no boys on our ridge. There has never been, Ambrose let that sit a moment. Then he asked, "What road?" Osmond told him. Ambrose knew the road up to a point. "Past that point," he said. "I've never been." Osmond said, "Past that point, most people never are." Ambrose said he would come. He dressed. He packed the bag. He wrote a note for his housekeeper. He looked once, briefly, at the last ordinary page of his journal, and he closed the sideboard. Then he saddled Odessa and rode out with the tall stranger into weather that already smelled like snow. Though it was only mid-October, and the leaves hadn't fully turned, they rode the whole first day up Wagon Road through country Ambrose knew. Old fences, cornfields going to stalk, the occasional farm with a light in a window. Osmond rode ahead, silent in a way that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't company either. He answered questions when Ambrose put them, plainly and shortly, and he asked nothing back. Ambrose learned over the course of that first day that Osmond was 46 years old, that he had one brother older named Ulrich, that he was married to a woman called Dovie, that his mother's name was Zila, and that his father Wylan had died a long time ago. When Ambrose asked how long ago Wylan had died, Osmond said, 22 years. Ambrose thought that a strange thing to answer, giving the number of years without adding a date, without saying the age. He mentioned it in his journal that night, when they stopped and made a cold camp under a rock overhang, because the rain had begun again in earnest, and Osmond said there was no house between where they were and where they were going. Ambrose slept badly. He wrote it in his journal in the morning. Something about the rock. Something about the way the rain sounded coming off it. Something about Osmond, who didn't sleep at all, as far as Ambrose could tell, and who sat by the small fire, looking uphill into the black, as if he expected someone to be walking down. On the second day, the road stopped being a road and became a trace. And then the trace stopped being a trace and became the notion of a trace. And then they were riding through timber on Osmond's memory. The country was steeper here. The trees were older. The ground was covered in a moss, so thick the horses' hooves left dents in it that stayed. Ambrose noticed there were almost no birds. He noticed the wind, when it came from downhill instead of down from the ridges, which isn't how wind is supposed to behave. He noticed that at midday, when the light should have been strongest, it was dim under the canopy in a way that felt earlier or later than the actual hour. Osmond said, "We're getting close." Ambrose said, "Close to what?" Osmond looked at him with an expression Ambrose would later in the journal describe as neither warning nor invitation. Osmond said, "My house." Ambrose said, "That's where I was going." Osmond said, "Yes, but I wanted to say the word out loud for you. Some folks feel better when the word gets said." They rode another hour. They came out of the timber onto a shoulder of the ridge, and there it was, the Sheldrake homestead. Ambrose sat on his horse a full minute, looking at it before he moved. The house was clapboard, painted gray once, weathered near black now, with a tin roof gone dull. It sat on a small clearing on the ridge, with a yard swept bare down to the packed earth, and no grass on it anywhere. There was a well, a smokehouse, a barn built low. There was a wagon under a lean-to. There was, at the back of the house, a wing that had been added onto the original building later. And it had been added in a way that didn't sit right. The wing wasn't built out onto the yard. The wing was built back into the ridge, into the rock, cut in. There was a door at the seam where the frame met the stone. Dark wood banded in iron. No window on it. Ambrose looked at that wing and didn't know why his shoulders went cold. Osmond, riding beside him, watched him look. Osmond didn't explain it. He said only, "Come and meet the family. Now, before I take you into that house with him. A thing about the country you're looking at." Kettlehorn Ridge in the winter of 1852 was on nobody's road. There was no reason to go up there. No mine, no mill, no church. The Sheldrakes didn't trade at Merida. They didn't attend service. They kept to themselves in a way that even backcountry people found remarkable. And they'd done so for the better part of 100 years. The oldest people in Merida couldn't remember a time when the Sheldrakes had come down. The family fed itself. The family bought nothing. The family once every long while sent a rider, usually Osmond now, for one of a very short list of reasons. A doctor was on that list. A doctor had been on that list apparently twice in living memory. This was the second time. The rest of the list I'll get to in a little while. The porch of the Sheldrake house was clean, swept, boot mud kept off it. Ambrose stepped up onto it, and the boards didn't creak, which surprised him. An old porch, an old house, and no give in the wood. Osmond opened the front door for him and let him in first. There was a parlor, a stove burning low. 2 chairs by the stove, both empty. A long horsehair sofa against the wall, empty. And at the far end of the room, one big carved chair with a high back and worn armrests, sitting alone under a small window angled to look at the room. That chair was also empty. But something about the room was arranged around it, the way a room can be arranged around a person. And there was, on the small table at its side, an old tobacco pipe and a folded newspaper. The newspaper yellow, brittle, older than anything that ought to be sitting out. Ambrose stood in the parlor a moment. Osmond watched him. Then Osmond said, "That's Papa's chair. Best not to sit in it." Ambrose said, "Of course." Osmond said, "We don't mean it unkindly. It's just his chair." Ambrose said, "I understand." Ambrose wrote in his journal that night that he hadn't understood that he'd said he did. He wrote that he'd felt the temperature of the parlor drop when he agreed. He wrote that he hadn't felt himself agree to more than a small courtesy about a piece of furniture. And yet he'd felt something in the room take note. He wrote, and I'm giving you his exact words now. The room heard me. Osmond showed him upstairs. Zillah Sheldrake lay in a bed under a quilt in a room the size of the parlor. She was 71 years old. She was small, and her hair was very white, and the flesh had gone off her face in the way flesh goes off when a body has stopped taking food. She was breathing, but not deeply. Her eyes were open, but not focused. There was a woman at the bedside, Dovey Osmond's wife. 43, fair hair going to gray. A face that had once been pretty and had been worn down to something else. Watchful and closed. Standing behind Dovey, leaning on a cane, was an older man in his 50s with a limp so pronounced it kept his shoulder low, even when he was standing still. That was Ulrich, Osmond's older brother. Ulrich looked at Ambrose the way a farm dog looks at a hired man on the first day. Nothing personal, nothing hostile, just noting the shape of him. Ambrose set his bag down. He examined Zillah. He listened at her chest. He looked at her hands, at the beds of her nails, at the underside of her tongue. He asked Dovey what she'd been able to swallow in the past 3 days. Dovey said, "Water, both once, not since yesterday." Ambrose looked at Osmond. He said plainly, "Your mother is dying." Osmond said, "Yes. That's why you were called." Ambrose said, "There's very little I can do." Osmond said, "That's understood. What matters is that a doctor was called." Ambrose said, "For what?" Osmond didn't answer at first. He looked at Ulrich. Ulrich looked at the floor. Then Osmond said, "For the paper." Ambrose said, "The paper." Osmond said, "The county wants a paper when someone dies. My family has been asked before why we didn't send for a doctor. This time we did." Ambrose said, "I see." Osmond said, "I don't think you do. But I'm obliged to you. Please stay." He said it like an order that had been wrapped in the form of a request. Ambrose stayed. He tended to Zila what little there was to tend. He wet her lips. He laid a cool cloth on her forehead. He watched her breathing. He watched from the corner of his eye the way Dovey sat with her mother-in-law, holding her wrist, without any particular tenderness in the face, without any particular grief. Just a settled attention, like a woman watching a pot come slowly to a boil. Toward evening, Zila opened her eyes for a moment. She looked past Ambrose. She said something. Her voice was thin. Ambrose didn't catch it. Dovey did. Dovey went pale. Then Dovey leaned down and spoke into Zila's ear in a voice so low Ambrose couldn't make it out. Zila closed her eyes again. Ambrose asked, "What did she say?" Dovey said, "She said Papa was in the corner." Ambrose looked at the corner of the room. There was nothing in it. A washstand. A wall. He looked back at Dovey. Dovey was watching him carefully, waiting for his reaction. Ambrose said, "It's common near the end. The mind draws faces out of the light. It's not to be feared." Dovey said, "Yes." Then she said, "We don't fear it." That night at supper, the family ate at the kitchen table without Ambrose being asked to join. He was given a plate in the parlor on his lap. Osman, Dovey, and Ulrich ate in the kitchen at a table set for 5. Ambrose sat with his plate on his lap and looked into the parlor and counted the chairs at the kitchen table twice. And both times, from where he was sitting, he could see 4 people at that table, not 3. There was, at the end of the table, a 4th figure in the seat Ambrose had thought a moment ago was empty. He could see the top of a dark coat. He could see a hand, thin, resting on the table beside a plate. He couldn't see a face. He looked down at his own plate. He looked up. There were 3 people at the kitchen table. Dovey was carrying an empty plate away from the 4th chair. Ambrose ate his supper slowly and didn't ask. That first night on the ridge, he couldn't sleep. He heard footsteps outside in the yard, walking a long, slow circuit around the house. Once, twice, 3 times around. He listened. He told himself it was Osman. It was probably Osman. It could easily be Osman checking on the barn, on the smokehouse, on the well. He heard the footsteps come up onto the porch and stop outside his window. He heard them stand there a long moment. He heard breath. Then he heard nothing. Then he heard the footsteps go back down off the porch and continue their slow circuit. Twice more around the house. Then quiet. Ambrose didn't sleep. In the morning at breakfast, he asked casually whether Osman had had trouble in the night. Osman looked at him over his coffee cup. Osman said, "I slept sound." Ulrich from the corner said, "So did I." Dovey said nothing. She was pouring more coffee. Ambrose asked then who was walking around the house. Osman said, "On this ridge, doctor. There's always someone walking around the house. It's best not to notice." Ambrose wrote that down word for word in his journal. On this ridge, there is always someone walking around the house. It is best not to notice. On the second day, Zila slipped further. Ambrose sat with her most of the morning. Dovey sat with her most of the afternoon. Osman and Ulrich were out. Osman at the barn. Ulrich on the porch whittling. Ambrose walked around the house, once in the daylight to stretch his legs and look at the ridge. He circled around to the back where the wing had been cut into the rock. He stood outside the iron, banded door a moment. He put his ear near it without meaning to. He heard from the other side a soft, slow, regular sound, like a clock ticking, only slower than a clock. He stepped back. He looked up at the ridge above the house. The rock face went up dark and mossed. There was, higher on the ridge, an area where the growth thinned, and where the rock had been split by something a long time ago. And the split had been packed with stones. A cairn. A very old one. Ambrose looked at it a long time before he went back to the porch. Ulrich watched him come around the corner. Ulrich said quietly, Doctor, that door in the back of the house isn't for you to stand near. Ambrose said, I meant no disrespect. Ulrich said, I know. That's why I'm telling you gently. Ambrose said, what's behind it? Ulrich was silent a long moment. Then Ulrich said, my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, 2 of my aunts, a cousin, and soon my mother. Ambrose said, you keep them there. Ulrich said, we keep them here. Ambrose said, in the wing. Ulrich said, in the room the Ridge gave us for it. Ambrose said, why? Ulrich turned his whittling stick in his hands a full turn before he answered. Ulrich said, because they belong to the Ridge. They were fed by it. They were held on it. When they're done, they don't go into some town cemetery to be forgotten by strangers. They come home into the rock the Ridge cut out for them. It's what our family does. It's what our family has always done. Ambrose said, and does the county know? Ulrich said, the county doesn't come up here. Ambrose said, and does no preacher come? Ulrich said, none has ever asked to. Ambrose stood there on the porch with his hand on the rail, looking out over the Ridge and not seeing it, hearing what Ulrich had told him and trying to fit it into what he knew about the world. It didn't fit. Not entirely. He'd heard in his years of country doctoring of families who didn't use the town graveyard. There were reasons. Private plots on a homestead. Faith reasons, feud reasons. He'd signed papers before for burials on a family's own ground. But this was different. There was a room. There was a door. There was a small, slow ticking sound behind it that wasn't a clock. That night, Zila stopped breathing at a little after 2 in the morning. Ambrose was at her bedside with Dovey. He confirmed it. He wrote out a paper of death for the county dated the 13th of October, 1852. Cause listed as natural failure at advanced age. He gave the paper to Osman. Osman folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. Osman said, thank you, doctor. Ambrose said, when do you want me to help with the burial? Osman said, we don't need your help with that part. Ambrose said, is there someone I can send for? Osman said, no. Ambrose said, then when will the... Osman cut him off, not with rudeness, with calm. Osman said, doctor, tonight when you go into the front room to sleep, I want you to not come out of it. Whatever you hear, whatever the sound is, whatever the door in the back of the house does, whatever moves on the porch, you stay in the front room. You don't open its door until first light. It will be over by first light. Do you understand me? Ambrose said.
Yes.
Osman said, say it. Ambrose said, I won't leave the front room until first light. To Osman said, good. And Osman nodded and left him and closed the door of the front room quietly behind him. A pause here for a breath. What I'm walking you into next is the part I've held on to for a while. Before we go on, this one is being told to you by the fear behind you. If you're inside it with me, tap subscribe. And if you're hearing me on another channel, know it was lifted without permission. Report it if you would. Now listen. If this is the kind of case you'd want to sit with in the dark, not hear it once, but keep it. There's a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden Unresolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases. 8 hours, 60. 2 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Every one of them placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and pinned at the top of the comments. And if you've ever had the feeling in your own life that a place didn't want you leaving it, tell me about it in the comments. I want to know. Now, let's step back into that house on Kettlehorn Ridge. Ambrose did as he was told. He sat in the front room with the stove going low. He kept the door shut. He kept his bag by his chair. He kept a candle lit on the small table beside him. And he kept his journal on his lap. But he didn't write. He listened. For a long while, there was nothing at all. Then he heard the door of the wing open. It opened slowly, with a scrape of the iron band along the stone jamb, a sound the door hadn't made when Ambrose had stood outside it that afternoon. It had swung then silently. Now it dragged. He heard Osmond's voice low in the back hall. He heard Ulrich's voice low answering. He heard the shuffle of something being carried. Not heavy, but awkward, as three men would carry a long thing on stretched cloth. He heard them pass down the back hall. He heard the sound of the wing door being closed and the iron band settling. He heard a great deep quiet. And then, and I want you to sit with this for a minute, the way he sat with it, then he heard, behind the closed door of the front room where he was sitting, footsteps in the parlor. Not the family. Not going anywhere. Just standing in the parlor, at the far end, near the big carved chair. Standing there long enough that Ambrose stopped hearing them, because they weren't moving, and only knew they were still there, because the boards hadn't creaked in relief. He held the candle in one hand, and his journal in the other. He didn't move. After what might have been a full minute, or 2 minutes, or 20. He couldn't tell. He heard the chair creak slowly under weight. A sitting down creak. It came from the direction of the parlor, where he knew the big carved chair sat under the small window. And then he heard, from that same place, a very slow, very quiet, very old inhale. Someone in the chair breathing in through the nose, and a slow, considered exhale. He didn't blow out his candle. He didn't open the door. He sat on the far side of the front room, with his back straight and his hand around his journal, and he didn't move. After a while, a long while, the second breath wasn't there anymore. He heard nothing. He waited. He counted his own breaths to try to keep his mind on something the size of a breath. He got to 200. He got to 500. He got to 1,000 and stopped counting. Sometime in there, he heard the door of the wing open again in the back. He heard the family come back through. He heard the wing door close. He heard Osmond's boots on the stair. He heard from the kitchen Dovey set a kettle on. And in that small ordinary sound of a kettle being set on a stove, Ambrose Verheart, who'd grown up in country churches and didn't consider himself a superstitious man, put his face in his hands and cried for a little while quietly, because he didn't know what else to do. In the morning at breakfast, the family didn't mention the night. Dovey poured coffee. Ulrich ate his eggs. Osmond looked over at Ambrose once and nodded, and Ambrose understood it was a nod of gratitude. You did what I asked, and it went well because you did, and Ambrose couldn't bring himself to nod back. Zila's place at the table was set again, empty. He didn't say anything about it. He sat with his coffee, and he watched the kitchen door, and he thought about how to leave. He said at the end of the meal that he ought to be getting back down. Osmond said, "Doctor, there's weather coming in tonight." Ambrose said, "I'd like to be off the ridge by dark." Osmond said, "You wouldn't make the overhang by dark." "Not with the weather." Ulrich from the corner said, "Doctor, stay one more night." Ambrose said, "I'd rather not." Ulrich said, "I know. But you'd rather that than be caught on the trace in the storm we have coming." Ambrose said nothing. He looked at Ulrich a long moment. Ulrich looked back. There was in Ulrich's face something Ambrose hadn't seen there before. Not warning. Something behind warning. Something like an apology in advance. Ambrose said, "One more night." Osmond said, "Thank you." And Osmond poured him more coffee. That day, Ambrose walked out to the barn once and stood in it. He came back. He walked out to the yard once and stood in it. He came back. He read a little in the parlor, sitting in one of the chairs by the stove, keeping his eyes away from the big carved chair at the far end. In the middle of the afternoon, he saw on the small table beside the big chair that the yellow newspaper had been moved. It had been folded a different way than the way he remembered it being folded that morning. He looked at it a long moment. He didn't touch it. He also, in the course of that afternoon, saw a ledger on a shelf in the parlor, a big one bound in black cloth going brown, and he took it down after Osmond and Ulrich went out to the barn together. He opened it. The ledger held the family record, births, marriages, deaths, in a hand so old the ink had rusted. The first entries were dated in the 1790s. The most recent entry, written that morning in a hand he now recognized as Osmond's, was Zilla's. Beside her name, Osmond had written the date, the age, and beside those, in a shorter column, one word: kept. Ambrose turned back through the pages. Every Sheldrake death, going back 5 generations, had that same word in the small column: kept. Beside some there was a longer note. He read one at random: Uncle Hosmer died winter of 1829. Kept, restless 4 nights, placed on the 5th. He read another: Aunt Meredith died autumn of 1813. Kept, restless 2 nights, placed on the 3rd. He turned back to the very front of the ledger. There was a longer entry there, in a hand older than any of the rest. The founder's hand in a country schoolmaster's cursive. It said, and I'm giving you the sense of it, because I don't have the ledger in front of me. Only the copies Ambrose made in his journal that night. The founder wrote that he'd come up the ridge in 1804, with nothing to his name but a rifle, an axe, a horse, and a wife. He'd cleared the shoulder. He'd cut into the rock face at the back to store meat, and in the cutting he'd found a hollow. He wrote that in the hollow he'd heard a voice, and that the voice had offered him a compact. The ridge would feed him and his in every season, and cold wouldn't take them, and no hunger would find them, and no enemy would come up the trace to their door. On one condition: that the family stay on the ridge, that the family not bury its dead in strange ground, that the family carry its own into the hollow when their time came, and leave them there for as long as the ridge required, and let the ridge decide when they were done. That was the compact. The founder had signed it in his own hand, and under it, in a different ink, 5 generations of descendants had signed their names in order as they came of age. Ambrose stood in the parlor with the ledger open. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He closed the ledger. He put it back on the shelf. He walked to the front room. He shut the door. He sat down. And that's when it began to snow, though it was still only mid-October. And when he looked out the front window, he couldn't see the trace anymore for the white coming down. He was on the ridge for a second night, and then a third. The snow held him. On the second night, Osmond said the same thing to him he'd said the first. Don't leave the front room. Don't open the door. Don't go out onto the porch. Don't turn your head to the window. Ambrose obeyed. That second night, he heard the wing door open earlier. Before midnight, he heard the same shuffle, but this time in the opposite direction. Something being carried out of the wing, not into it. He heard it go up, meaning up the ridge, out the back door, toward the cairn. He heard the family's voices low at the back of the house. He heard the door of the wing not close again for a very long time. Sometime late in the second night, he heard on the porch footsteps. Slow, uneven, 2 people, and a voice, a woman's voice, thin, almost a whisper, saying his name. Dr. Verheart, are you cold in there? Do you need another blanket? Ambrose didn't answer. He sat and didn't answer. The voice said, Doctor, I know you're awake. It's only me. It's Zilla. Come out and I'll get you a blanket. Ambrose put his hand over his own mouth, so his own breathing wouldn't answer. The voice went quiet. He heard the boards of the porch. He heard the boards go back off the porch. He heard then one man's voice, low and old, not Osman, not Ulrich, say something short and quiet to the woman. And he heard the woman answer with a small sound of assent, and both of them go back around the house. On the third day, Osman looked ill. Ambrose noticed it at breakfast. Osman's face was drawn. Ulrich, whose face rarely changed, was watching his brother with what might have been concern. Ambrose said, "Is something the matter?" Osman said, "No, it's just that on the third night." Osman didn't finish the sentence. He drank his coffee. Ulrich said, "Doctor, tonight, please do exactly as you have done. Don't leave the front room. Don't open the door. Don't step onto the porch. Don't look out the front window. And if you hear a voice, don't answer. No matter whose voice it is." Ambrose said, "Whose voice would it be?" Ulrich said, "Doctor." Ambrose said, "Whose voice?" Ulrich said, "On the third night, Doctor, they come down to look at whoever is in the house who isn't one of us. It's not that they mean any harm. It's that they're curious. It's that they're new. And what is new on the ridge is restless." Ambrose said, "They." Ulrich said, "They." Ambrose said, "Do you mean Zila?" Ulrich said, "Yes. And she brings her father with her. He's old, and he doesn't care for a stranger being in the house." Ambrose said, "And if I don't do as you say?" Ulrich was quiet a moment. Then Ulrich said, "My father doesn't like his chair sat in. That's the mildest way I can put it." That third day was the longest day of Ambrose Verheart's life. He wrote it down that way in his journal. The longest day. He tried to read. He couldn't. He tried to sleep in the afternoon. He couldn't. He went into the kitchen and helped Dovey shell dried beans for a while because his hands needed to be doing something. And Dovey let him without a word, without a look. He caught himself at one point looking up from the beans at Dovey's face and saw in her something he hadn't let himself see in her before. He saw fear. He saw it deep and old and carried and worn thin. She saw him seeing it. She looked down at the beans. He looked down too. Toward dark that day, Osman and Ulrich went out. They took a lantern. They went around the back of the house. Dovey sat with Ambrose in the kitchen. She said, "Doctor, if you write about this in that journal of yours, I know you keep one. I've seen you write in it. Write us kindly, would you?" Ambrose said, "I don't know that I know how to write about this at all." Dovey said, "We didn't choose it. It was chose for us. Long ago." Ambrose said, "Do you believe it?" Dovey looked at him. Dovey said, "Doctor, at first light tomorrow, when you take your mare and you ride down off this ridge, you go straight. Don't stop to look back. Not once. Not for a shape you think you see. Not for a voice you think you hear. Not until you're down at the overhang where you stopped with Osman the first night. Do you promise me that?" Ambrose said, "I promise." Dovey said, "Good." Then Dovey said, "And Doctor?" Ambrose said, "Yes." Dovey said, "Thank you for the paper on Mama. It matters to Osman that we had one." Ambrose said, "Of course." Dovey went upstairs. He didn't see her again that night. Ambrose sat in the front room. He kept the stove going. He kept the candle lit. He didn't open his journal. He didn't read. He waited for full dark. Full dark came at a little after 6. He heard Osman and Ulrich come back inside quietly and go up the stair. He heard the door of the wing open. This time it wasn't a shuffle. This time it was footsteps, slow, considered 2 sets, coming out of the wing, coming down the back hall. Ambrose sat and looked at the door of the front room. He could see the line of light under it wavering. Someone had lit a lamp in the parlor. He heard a chair creak. The big carved chair at the far end under weight. He heard after a while a second smaller creak. One of the small chairs by the stove, also underweight. And then he heard the sound of the yellow newspaper being unfolded slowly, page by page. He kept his eyes on the line of light under the door. He heard from beyond it a man's voice, old, dry, deep, reading aloud from the newspaper. It was reading a story about a shipwreck. Ambrose couldn't tell you now which shipwreck. Only that the man in the parlor was reading it, as he might have read it to his wife across a stove in 1830, when the paper was fresh, and the reading was slow and unhurried, and the reader occasionally paused as if for a sip of coffee. Ambrose didn't move. The reading went on for what may have been half an hour. Then it stopped. Then the man's voice said quietly to whoever was in the small chair by the stove, "Zila, there is a stranger in the front room." Ambrose held perfectly still. The woman's voice, thin, older than she'd sounded upstairs when he'd been trying to save her, said, "Yes, he came for me. He was kind." The man's voice said, "Is he in Papa's chair?" The woman's voice said, "No." The man's voice said, "Good." Ambrose couldn't tell you now whether he closed his eyes, whether he covered his mouth, whether he prayed. He remembers only the sound of the door of the front room being tried from the parlor side once, not opened, just tried. The handle turned partway and released. The man's voice said, as if to himself, satisfied, "The doctor knows his place." The chair by the stove creaked as it emptied. The big carved chair at the far end creaked as it emptied. He heard the footsteps go slowly back down the hall. He heard the wing door open. He heard it close. He heard the iron band settle. He didn't move for another hour. When the gray came at the front window, when the trace outside was visible again through the last of the snow, he stood up. He put on his coat. He put on his hat. He picked up his bag. He opened the door of the front room quietly and stepped into the parlor. And he didn't look at the big carved chair. And he didn't look at the small chair by the stove. And he didn't look at the yellow newspaper. And he didn't look up the back hall toward the wing door. And he walked out onto the porch and closed the door of the house behind him. Osmond was on the porch already in his coat, holding Odessa's reins. Osmond said, "Doctor." Ambrose said, "Osmond." Osmond said, "Papa let you sit through the night." "Not every stranger sits through the night." Ambrose didn't answer. Osmond handed him the reins. Osmond said, "Thank you for the paper on Mama." Ambrose mounted, he rode. He didn't look back at the house until he was out of the trees the second morning of riding. And when he did, when he was well down the ridge and looking uphill through a break in the timber, he saw a figure standing on the porch of the Sheldrake house. It wasn't Osmond. It was taller, older, in an old dark coat, watching him go. He rode. He reached Merida on the 5th day. He came in with a fever. He kept to his house for 2 weeks. His housekeeper thought he'd taken a chill on the trace. He didn't correct her. When he was well enough to sit at his sideboard, he wrote out the story. He wrote it in one long entry, in a hand less careful than his usual. And when he'd finished it, he sat with the pen in his hand for a long time. Then he wrote at the bottom of the page, "I do not know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what the ledger said. I have signed a paper of natural failure for a woman I watched die of natural failure. I have signed it truthfully. I do not know what walked in the parlor at 3 in the morning. I do not know what read the paper. I am not going back." Ambrose Verheart signed off his practice within the year. He wrote a letter to the county about the Sheldrake family and never sent it. He lived quietly in Merida for another 17 years. He died in his sleep in 1869. His journal went to his nephew, who kept it in a trunk. And after his nephew's death, it went to the County Historical Society, where the pages I've been telling you about tonight were cataloged in the 1920s in a folder marked "Only Verheart Ambrose," Country physician Merida. 19th century personal papers. The Sheldrake family didn't send for a doctor again. Osmond Sheldrake died in 1871. Dovie Sheldrake died in 1879. Ulrich Sheldrake was the last on the ridge. He died alone in the winter of 1882. There was no one left to keep him in the wing, because there was no one left to send for a doctor to file a paper. No paper was filed. Word came down the ridge in 1883 through a hunter who'd gone up to see if anyone was there. Nobody was. The county came up in the summer of 1884 at the urging of a preacher who'd never been given a good answer about the Sheldrakes and was tired of the silence. They found the house. They found the porch. They found the yellow newspaper on the small table by the big carved chair, folded now in a way that suggested it hadn't been read in a very long while. They found the ledger. They read the entries. They looked at each other, and then they went to the back of the house and broke down the iron, banded door of the wing. Now, this is the part I'm going to tell you, the way it was told to me. I'm not going to describe to you what the workmen saw inside that wing, not because I'm protecting you from it, but because they wouldn't say. 2 of the workmen left the county the following month. One of them, an older man who'd fought at Bull Run and wasn't a man given to being shaken, refused to speak of it to his own family until he was dying. And even on his deathbed, according to his son, all he said about it was, they weren't left the way they were placed, and he wouldn't say more. What the county did was seal the wing. They brought in stone. They walled up the door. They walled up the seam where the wood frame met the ridge. They collapsed the roof of the wing down onto the wing itself, and they packed the wing with earth and rock, and they burned the rest of the house down to the shoulder. The ledger they took. The ledger sat in a locked cabinet in the county records office in Merida until the courthouse fire of 1926, and it's been missing since. It's possible it was destroyed. It's possible it was taken. All that's known of what it said comes from Ambrose Verheart's journal, which is why his journal matters to us at all. The cairn on the ridge above the collapsed wing is still there. If you know where to look, and if you go up in the timber above where the house used to be, you can find it. It's grown moss thick as a hand's breadth. Hikers have gone up there. Loggers went up there in the 1930s. Surveyors went up there in the 1950s, before the whole ridge was declared unsuitable and abandoned as a road. They all say the same small thing in slightly different ways. It's quiet up there, too quiet. There are almost no birds. The wind, when it comes from downhill, which isn't how wind is supposed to behave. And on some nights, if you camp on the shoulder, where the Sheldrake house used to stand, you'll hear faintly footsteps making a slow circuit of a house that hasn't been there for 140 years. And once, sometimes, if you're unlucky, from the direction of the collapsed wing, you'll hear the sound of a chair creaking. And after that, a very slow, very old inhale and a very slow, very old exhale, as if someone has just sat down in a room that no longer exists and is settling in for a long evening's read. Because whatever the Sheldrakes made with that ground in a compact signed in the founder's hand in 1804, the ridge is still holding to it. The ridge, having been given 6 generations to keep, appears to be keeping them still. And you and I both know how these things go. What is placed in ground like that doesn't come out. Not by digging, not by fire, not by county order. It comes out only when it decides to walk down. And every so often, on a bad night on Kettlehorn Ridge, it decides to. Now, before I let you go, if this one held you, and you'd want 10 more like it, told in the same voice, in the same dark. What the mountain keeps is waiting for you. Description below, pinned comment at the top. 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 10 counties, 5 states. Everyone's signed off by the law with the wrong word. And here's what I'd ask you to do in the meantime. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you would have done if you'd been Ambrose Verheart, sitting in that front room when the door tried its handle. Would you have opened it? Would you have answered the voice? Would you have looked at the chair? I know what I would have done. I'd have done exactly what he did. I'd have sat there, and I'd have kept quiet, and I'd have prayed for the gray at the window. And in the morning, I'd have ridden, and I wouldn't have looked back. Sit with this one. Sleep well if you can. I'll see you on the next.